The moment you stop chasing, something magical happens. People start noticing you, valuing you, and realizing what they've been taking for granted all along. When you chase, you're communicating long before you ever speak. Human beings are constantly reading signals, patterns, energy, and emotional posture. Chasing tells a story, and that story says urgency, fear of loss, imbalance of power. It doesn't matter how kind, loving, or genuine your intentions are. The nervous system of the other person picks up on one thing above all else. You are leaning forward while they are standing still. And in human psychology, whoever leans forward is unconsciously perceived as lower in value, not because they are less worthy, but because they are signaling that the connection matters more to them than to the other person. Need changes perception. It always has. Stillness does the opposite. Stillness communicates self-regulation. It shows emotional control. It says, I want connection, but I don't require it to validate who I am. That difference is subtle, but powerful. When you stop chasing, you are no longer asking to be chosen. You are allowing yourself to be observed, and observation is where value is assessed. People don't appreciate what they don't have space to miss. Constant availability removes the emotional contrast that creates desire, respect, and curiosity. Self-worth is not something you announce. It's something people infer from how you move, how you wait, how you respond, and how you tolerate silence. A person with self-worth does not panic when energy is not reciprocated. They do not rush to explain themselves. They do not overcorrect. They do not chase clarity from someone who is comfortable being unclear. Instead, they pause. And that pause is not weakness. It's emotional authority. Chasing often feels like effort, honesty, and commitment to the person doing it. But to the receiver, it often feels like pressure. Pressure makes people pull away instinctively. Not because they don't care, but because the emotional weight feels unbalanced. When someone senses that you are more invested than they are, they unconsciously relax. They stop showing up fully. They assume you'll compensate. This is how chasing slowly trains people to give you less while expecting more from you. Stillness disrupts that dynamic. When you stop chasing, the emotional labor shifts. The other person begins to feel the absence of your effort. Not immediately, but gradually. The nervous system notices changes before the conscious mind does. They feel less pursued, less reassured, less prioritized. And that absence forces reflection. People rarely reflect when everything is being handed to them. Self-worth is reflected in boundaries, not ultimatums. Boundaries don't demand. They simply exist. When you stop chasing, you are enforcing an internal boundary that says, I will not overextend myself where I'm not met. This is not punishment. It's alignment. And alignment is attractive because it feels stable, predictable, and grounded. Chasing often comes from a fear that if you stop moving, everything will collapse. But relationships that collapse when you stop chasing were never supported by mutual effort in the first place. They were being held together by one person's emotional energy. Stillness reveals the truth, and truth is uncomfortable but necessary. People respect what doesn't beg for permission to exist. When you stop chasing, you are no longer negotiating your worth. You are no longer trying to convince someone of your value through effort. You are allowing them to experience the consequence of your absence. Not as manipulation, but as reality. Stillness also shifts your internal state. When you stop chasing, your nervous system settles. You stop living in anticipation. You stop checking for responses. You stop reading into delays. You return to yourself. And that return changes your posture, your tone, your choices. People respond differently to someone who is emotionally settled versus someone who is emotionally reaching. Self-worth is felt before it is understood. When you move from chasing to stillness, people feel the difference even if they can't explain it. They sense that you are no longer available on demand. They sense that access to you now requires effort, presence, and respect, and that changes behavior. Chasing says, I'm afraid to lose you. Stillness says, I trust myself if I do. That message is not spoken, but it is heard clearly. Human beings are drawn to those who trust themselves, because trust is contagious. Stillness does not mean indifference. It means discernment. It means choosing not to pour energy into places where it leaks away. It means allowing reciprocity to reveal itself naturally. When you stop chasing, you give others the opportunity to step forward. Some will, some won't, and both outcomes give you clarity. Self-worth grows when you stop performing for acceptance. Chasing often turns connection into performance. You become the initiator, the fixer, the emotional regulator. Stillness removes you from that role, and without you carrying the weight, the dynamic either equalizes or collapses. Both outcomes restore balance. People start noticing you not because you disappeared, but because you stopped compensating. Your silence becomes noticeable because it is new. Your absence has contrast because your presence was consistent. And contrast creates awareness. Stillness communicates that you are not driven by anxiety, that you can tolerate uncertainty, that you are not controlled by fear of abandonment. Those traits signal emotional maturity, and emotional maturity commands respect. When you stop chasing, you stop teaching people that they can show up halfway and still receive full access to you. You stop rewarding inconsistency. You stop validating avoidance. You allow natural consequences to do what words never could. Self-worth is quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't chase closure. It doesn't chase validation. It simply withdraws energy where it is not returned. And in that withdrawal, people either wake up or walk away. Stillness gives you leverage without force, power without aggression, presence without pursuit. And that shift is often the moment when people finally see you clearly. Not as someone trying to be chosen, but as someone who chooses themselves first. Space is uncomfortable for most people because it removes distraction. When someone is always present, always initiating, always reaching out, there is no reason to reflect. The connection becomes background noise, familiar, expected, and the human mind does not assign value to what feels permanent and guaranteed. Space interrupts that certainty. It creates a pause where awareness can finally enter. Awareness is born in contrast. People rarely notice what something means to them while it is constantly available. They notice it when it's gone, delayed, or reduced. Not because absence is a tactic, but because space forces the brain to fill in what is missing. When you stop chasing and create space, you remove the constant stimulation that kept the other person emotionally passive. Space activates curiosity. The mind begins to ask questions it never asked before. Why is it quieter? Why isn't there the same effort? Why do I feel this difference? These questions are not always conscious. Often they show up as restlessness, mild anxiety, or sudden thoughts about you that feel uninvited. That's awareness forming. When you are always present, people don't have to choose you. You are simply there. Space reintroduces choice, and choice is where value becomes visible. When someone has to decide whether to reach out, invest, or step forward, they are forced to measure how much you matter to them. That internal measurement never happens when you do all the work. Space also reveals emotional dependency patterns. If someone only feels connected when you are chasing, reassuring, or initiating, space exposes that imbalance. It shows whether the connection was mutual or one-sided, not through confrontation, but through observation. Space tells the truth without speaking. People often fear space because they confuse it with rejection. But space is not withdrawal of care, it is withdrawal of overextension. It is the removal of excess effort that was masking the natural rhythm of the relationship. When space appears, the relationship either stretches to meet it or snaps under the tension. Both outcomes bring clarity. Awareness leads to recalibration. When someone becomes aware of your value through absence, they often change their behavior. They reach out more intentionally. They show up with more presence. They become more responsive. Not because they were manipulated, but because they finally noticed what your consistent presence had been contributing emotionally. Space also changes how people remember you. Memory is shaped by emotion, not frequency. Constant contact flattens emotional memory. Space sharpens it. Interactions become more vivid. Your words carry more weight. Your presence feels more intentional, less diluted. When you stop chasing, you stop cushioning people from the emotional consequences of their disengagement. Space allows those consequences to be felt, and feelings drive awareness far more effectively than explanations ever could. You can talk endlessly about how you deserve effort, but space demonstrates it silently. Awareness is not always comfortable. Sometimes space makes people defensive. Sometimes it triggers fear of loss. Sometimes it reveals that they took you for granted. Those realizations can be unsettling. But discomfort is often the doorway to change. Space also protects you. It gives you room to observe instead of react, to assess instead of assume, to see whether someone moves toward you when effort is no longer handed to them. This shifts your focus from trying to be enough to evaluating what you are receiving. People notice your value more clearly when you are not constantly proving it. Space removes the performance aspect of connection. You are no longer auditioning for attention. You are simply present when it is mutual and absent when it is not. That consistency builds quiet authority. Awareness often arrives late, sometimes only after space has existed long enough to be felt deeply. This is why people often reach out unexpectedly after silence, not because they suddenly remembered you exist, but because space gave their mind room to process the emotional shift. Space reveals priorities. What people prioritize is what they move toward without being chased. When you stop chasing, you stop inflating your importance artificially. You allow true importance to surface naturally. Awareness also changes self-perception. When someone realizes they miss you, think about you, or feel your absence, they are forced to reassess how they positioned you in their life. That reassessment can elevate your value in their mind more than any effort you could have made while chasing. Space does not guarantee someone will choose you, and that is its power. It is honest. If someone does not step forward when space appears, it means the connection relied on your pursuit. Knowing that frees you from investing further into imbalance. When you stop chasing, space becomes a mirror. It reflects interest, effort, and intention accurately. No distortion, no compensation, just truth. People start noticing you not because you disappeared, but because space gave them the opportunity to feel the difference between having access to you and not having it. And once awareness forms, it cannot be undone.